Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. It would have been smarter, potentially, to do 2018's Halloween on Halloween. However, I could talk endlessly about these videos and scheduling and trying to arrange them in a way that makes sense around subject matters and the sense of a sense of creative thought going into how and when I make certain videos, but it bores me to talk about it, never mind people listening about it. And so consequently there is the issue of course, the newly released Halloween Kills, which I would like to cover, and ideally cover before the end of the month. And also the fact that, as things stand, I have certain videos ready and lined up for Halloween itself that pretty much have nothing to do with the time of year, but as I've said, this whole month I've been trying to do more horror centric stuff. Maybe not as much as April, inexplicably, but again, I've sort of veered more back towards horror and towards Halloween, and so this seems in keeping to now cover today's film today. And as I said all the way back in April, when I covered 1978's Halloween, slashers weren't necessarily of all the horror subgenres, they are, I think, the subgenre that I have the least interest or experience in. You know, having not even seen the original Halloween until I covered it for this series. And so, well, at the time I said I praised the original 1978 Halloween. I praised the fact that it isn't just a slasher, that it uses the slasher, the serial killer story to develop a sense of atmosphere and lore and legacy that gives the film more than just a basic slasher of the 70s and then we'll go on into the 80s, which I have seen, and none, or almost none, if you sort of put a pin in the more supernatural stuff like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, none have, when it comes to traditional human slasher films, until you get to something like Scream, none of them really know how to do it even half as well as the original Halloween. And of course we then developed this whole franchise of Halloween films, and if I haven't already said, which I imagine I would have done, I don't like horror sequels for the most part. There are exceptions, Aliens, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which I actually do think is the best Nightmare on Elm Street films, perhaps the early Friday the 13th, because there was a ongoing story, at least in the early ones, to sort of unpack. But broadly speaking, as is demonstrable by the slashers of the 70s and 80s and all the great horror films that have continued to have sequels, it becomes diminishing returns. And with Halloween, it is almost the exemplar of that case, where every Halloween film, with the exception of Season of the Witch, Halloween 3, which has nothing to do with Michael Myers, the Halloween franchise, each film diminished the original story, despite the fact, of course, with John Carpenter's involvement in the early ones, even where he continued the sequels, and then beyond him, it undermined the power of the original Halloween film. And then, of course, you then had H2O, where it tried to reboot and sort of keep the original and the first sequel in place, and to some popularity. And then, of course, you had the sequel to that, which was a huge dud with Busta Rhymes. I feel like I'm making that up, but I'm fairly confident. Busta Rhymes getting into a fist fight with Michael. Then you had the two rebooted Halloween films by Rob Zombie, which their own little universe, whatever. And so you just ended up, by the time we got to 2018's Halloween, there was just this sense that we were never going to recapture the magic of the original. The genre had moved on. I mean, we were post-Scream, we were post-Cabin in the Woods. There was this sense of how do you recreate the authenticity of the original Halloween film, in this kind of landscape where not only have we exhausted the genre, but we have, metatextually exhausted the subject matter. But I do wonder whether, on some level, because we've gone to the depths and analysed and subverted and metatextually broken down films about slashers or about horror as a whole, whether these things are cyclical. I mean, I've always said that horror or genre storytelling is cyclical, and we return to the same stories again and again and again in different ways, with different generations and different attitudes. And there is something to be said about the idea that we are going back to the more stripped down, simple horror sort of reimaginings. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing some of the classics like Michael Myers with Halloween or Chucky, where we're seeing a desire to try and restart these stories to varying success. But when it comes to David Gordon Green's Halloween 2018, I really do think that he did strike gold, that there was something about the way that he reimagined Halloween, the idea of taking the original film and wiping the board again, like H2O did, but not even including the first sequel, so we only have the original John Carpenter Halloween film going straight into this film with the 40-year gap. I don't know, there is a sort of relief to it. You get that sense of creative freedom where we watch the original and we get that sense of, okay, this is a true, tried and true atmospheric slasher film, and within the story itself, of course, you have this horrific event, and then there's a 40-year gap of nothing, and then we return to Haddonfield, and we return to Michael Myers, and you get that sense of sort of, I suppose, conflicting ideologies, because on the one hand, as a character points out within the story, Michael Myers killed a handful of people 40 years ago, and so therefore significantly more horrific things have happened in the 40 years. Why would attention be drawn to this one random spree killer? Similarly, but then I suppose conversely, you have that sense of legacy and cult, and the idea of people obsessing over Michael Myers. I mean, particularly, of course, the podcasters, and then, of course, Dr. Sartain, or Sartain, sorry, is his name, Dr. Sartain, and you get that sense of what draws you in. And again, I know I've said about the stripped-down simplicity of Halloween 2018, and yet there is something of the metatext. I think there is an inevitability because we read into these things, but it becomes about the culture around the Halloween franchise and Michael Myers, and why we keep coming back to him, and why, of all of the slasher films, why he is held up and remembered and revisited. And there is that sense of legacy to him, and within the confines of the story itself, you get that sense of characters wanting to explore, developing this obsession with Michael Myers and what he is and the way that he functions. The fact that the one thing that universally, maybe not the Rob Zombies question mark, but most of the original run of Halloween films did, is that they have always kept Michael Myers the same. Yes, we can talk about psychic nieces and thorn cults and sort of when the Halloween franchise veered into the supernatural territory, but the personality and the way that Michael Myers functions remains the same. He has always remained silent, and he has always just been this shark-like creature who just kills, and we don't understand why. We can read into it and interpret it, but we don't really get it. And as I said, time and time and time again, when it comes to horror, it is our failure to understand which is the core of horror. The idea that we don't know why something is the way it is, and we cannot empathize with it, we cannot understand it. It is definitely the case why we love films like Jaws and Alien, because again, it's the idea of something that we cannot relate to, we cannot bargain with. It is just simply the coming of death. And Michael Myers is the human embodiment of that. And so you could say, when you get into the Halloween sequels with the Thorn cult and all the psychic stuff, and then into sort of the redneck structures of the Rob Zombie films, that yeah, these are interpretations, and characters within the story and creators outside, who try to read into Michael Myers, try to contextualize what he did, and yet none of these things stuck because we don't understand, and we fundamentally will never understand, because in the real world we fundamentally don't understand serial killers. We interpret, and of course psychologists break down why people do what they do, but we don't understand. And I think Michael Myers is almost the extreme end of that, where he is so devoid of humanity and empathy and relatability that people are drawn into the fact that they don't understand him. And so the characters within the film desperately are trying to put a context to it, trying to put a meaning, a rationality to it, and develop these obsessions. So when, of course, Sartain becomes this almost like cult-like devotee of Michael Myers, you understand that why he's sort of fallen the way he has, and yet he still fails to understand, because Michael Myers does not care that this guy has become almost like a worshipper, because Michael Myers doesn't have empathy and simply has two functions: to go forwards and to kill. And I think there's something very primordial about it, and I think that's, again, what makes this film, is that it understands Michael, and it understands that kind of story. And then, of course, on the other side of the film, of course, you've got the return of Laurie, and of course this is now her second return, if you include, her death in whichever Halloween film she originally died, and then they brought her back for H2O, which of course disregarded all but two of the sequels, and then killed her in Resurrections. And then again, this film, which has discarded all of the sequels except for the original film, and Laurie's back. And again, there is a depth and maturity to this film, where it's about trauma and the ways in which people process trauma. And the idea that, of course, as I said, this film, in the world of the film, Michael Myers killed 4 or 5 people, and she was the survivor. And so the rest of the world moves on, her daughter moves on, her granddaughter moves on, and yet she is unable to, because she was there and she lived through the trauma. But what I appreciate is the idea that she doesn't have... There is a sense of almost worship of Michael Myers, in terms of her life has been devoted to preparing to fight him, and that there is almost a idolization that exists within that story. But whereas when Sartain or the podcasters talk to her and they talk about him like he is otherworldly, she keeps returning to the fact that he is just a person, and she is, and the idea that on some level she has lost her humanity, and so on some level she is the closest to empathizing with Michael and connecting with him. But again, the nature that is Michael Myers is the idea that we, even as audience members, try to interpret what his motivations are, and yet we assume that he has specifically tracked down and hunted the podcasters because they came to see him, and that he is almost working his way back through, people who he's encountered recently, and then is going to find Laurie. And yet, that's an interpretation, the idea that he stalked the podcasters and then killed them first because they provoked him. We don't know that. There is something even simpler, which is just that Michael Myers remembered Judith and started there, and by chance came across the podcasters, who he, of course, had met and would remember them, and just simply started his killings with them. Again, these things can be interpreted, and like I say, the nature of Michael Myers is that you can read into it however you like, and David Gordon Green really understands how, by leaving it ambiguous, by only understanding Michael through the perceptions of other characters, means that he becomes this enigma that we just don't understand. And so, you have these two really strong aspects of the story where it's about Laurie and trauma and the idea that she's almost built herself to be the anti-Michael Myers, and Michael just simply waiting, and then the universe itself almost creating opportunity for him. And again, interpretation is available there, whether was it Sartain, was it Laurie? I've heard different readings into how Michael escaped, the bus crash happened and how Michael escaped, but again, it's left ambiguous. But again, the fact that he simply waited, maybe not even knowing, but just time allowed him to return to what he did, quote unquote, best. And then these two conflicting forces coming together. And the film's not perfect, because of course, between these two really heavy, complicated ideas, of course you have characters like the granddaughter and her group of friends, and of course we've got to sort of shove in our contemporary ideas of sort of your slasher victims and sort of your group of young people who will of course all be picked off one by one, and they're there as cannon fodder, although I do appreciate that they do have personalities, at least to some degree, and the tragedy of them is the fact that you see a version of the story where they are in a teen drama until Michael Myers arrives and then picks them off one by one. But frankly, they are still just there to be cut down. And you've got the granddaughter character, and I wish I got her more. I wish she was as good as Jamie Lee Curtis was in the original, but she is, at best, tolerable. And unfortunately, it is. I'm hoping that maybe in the two sequels that will make up this trilogy, they will develop her further following the events of this film. If anything, the one between them, the mother, I think is a really interesting character. Particularly, the fact that she has an arc as somewhat, the fact that Laurie tried to raise her as a hunter as a child. She was taken away, has tried to completely suppress all those events and move on, and then has to almost come back to her experience and her abilities when, of course, Michael Myers comes along. There's just a great moment towards the end of the film with her that's just, even I did not, considering the trouble with slashers is that, of course, the nature of the kills is very predictable. There's a moment in this film that I genuinely thought, wow, that is very well done. But yeah, and then I suppose the other thing that doesn't quite work is the Haddonfield stuff. Because like I said, in my original Halloween video, Haddonfield had this atmosphere, this haunting nature to it that existed outside of the events of the film. It felt like almost a ghost story without ghosts, where a serial killer was coming, as if ghosts were about to be made. Whereas in this film, there just isn't that same sense of atmosphere. There are moments, like with the opening scene, like with the bus crash, where there is this sense of hysteria and delirium, but it doesn't feel like it's location-based. And maybe in the sequel we'll get that, in Kills and then Ends, that we'll get that sense that, of course, this town is now haunted by, the three strikes of Michael, but it's a shame because it just felt like it could be anywhere, really. But yeah, this was great. I totally understand why people praised it a few years ago, and I do regret slightly overlooking it because, again, I'm just not as into slashers. but I appreciate the fact that it knows how to do the slasher film right. I mean, the fact that it isn't gratuitous, well, it is, don't get me wrong, it's graphic, but it's not gratuitous, I suppose. Because, and this is again feeding into the nature of Michael Myers, it's not about slow, brutal kills and gore. It's simply about I suppose, the efficiency of the kill. And the nature of Michael Myers is the fact that, yes, sometimes he will be brutal and there will be a little bit of gore, but with Michael Myers, it's about, I suppose, like I say, the efficiency of it, and the fact that sometimes he will be calculating and hunting, but ultimately it is to do as quick and efficient a kill as possible, which is quite novel when it comes to slashers, because of course so many of them are about prolonging the horror, the grotesquerie of it, whereas it's not really. And I think that again feeds into the quality of the film, because the way that some of the scenes play out, the way that he stalks, the way that he attacks, sometimes is drawn out, but it's not drawn out because of his intention. It's drawn out because he is simply waiting to strike. And I think that shows a certain level of discipline where it comes to the choreography of horror. No, this is a great film, and no, it is not as good as the original, but the original is phenomenal. I said at the time how phenomenal it was, how amazed I was by it. But this is still great. It is still up there, and I really do hope these two sequels, one which I will see in a matter of course, and the other, of course, I think will come next year. I appreciate... I want them to be good, because I want to see this be a complete trilogy that tells a conclusive story of Michael Myers, if that is, and Laurie Strode, if that is what David Gordon Green's vision is to complete the story. Who's to say? Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it's all helped me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.